I used to believe that if you worked hard enough, stayed loyal long enough, and treated people with integrity, even in the ruthless world of business, then, somehow, fairness would eventually find its way back to you. That belief shattered on a bright Monday morning in Seattle, inside the executive boardroom of Norwell Dynamics, the very company I had helped build from the ground up, the same one I'd kept afloat when its founder had to step down due to illness. That morning I had just finished presenting our quarterly results, a polished, data-driven breakdown showing we had crossed the $52 million mark in Q2 revenue, our highest to date. I still remember the final slide. Q2 surge, a record quarter, illuminating the screen behind me as I stepped aside. Then Thomas Granger, the new CEO brought in less than 3 months earlier, stood up, adjusted his silver cufflinks, and offered a smile so hollow it chilled the room. "Before we wrap up," he said, his voice smooth as velvet over a blade, "I have a small announcement regarding our leadership restructuring." My hand was still hovering over the trackpad when he walked slowly toward the front. Every executive in that room fell silent. Some looked confused. Others, those who had been whispering in corners lately, wouldn't meet my eyes. "As of today," Thomas continued, "Monica Laird will be stepping down as Chief Operating Officer. Her contributions have been significant, and we're deeply grateful. But as we transition into a more agile phase of growth, we require leaner leadership with less operational drag." He paused, then added, almost with amusement, "I believe, Monica. Just last week you advised we slow down hiring and invest in development before scaling too fast. That kind of caution has its place. Just not now." I didn't say a word. No tears, no protest. Just silence. Not from shock, but from certainty. Because I had seen this coming. I had prepared. While Thomas took over the clicker and launched his Phase 2 optimization slides, I walked back to my office, calm and unshaken, as if I was simply heading to lunch. They had no idea. Not one of them knew that while they were sharpening their knives behind closed doors, I had already made my move, quietly, surgically, and precisely. None of them realized that the cornerstone supplier their entire expansion plan relied on now belonged to me. From the moment Thomas Granger walked through Norwell's doors as the board-appointed CEO, I sensed a shift, not loud or immediate, but the kind of subtle tension that lingers like the smell of rain before a storm. He came from a world I never trusted, venture firms obsessed with speed, disruption, and quarterly optics, places where people were statistics and wisdom was mistaken for resistance. While I had helped steer Norwell through its most turbulent years, Thomas entered like a man scanning blueprints, already identifying what to bulldoze. He never once called me a partner, nor did he ask about the systems I'd built or the team I had nurtured from the ground up. Instead, he began rearranging things, small changes at first, like cancelling standing meetings without notice or revising implementation schedules that had taken months to calibrate. But soon it was unmistakable. Strategies I had approved were being reversed quietly, often without my knowledge, and decisions were moving behind closed doors I was no longer invited to open. At first, I told myself it was transitional friction, new leadership adjusting. But then came the whispers. Colleagues I had mentored started acting distant, carefully neutral, as if aligning with me now carried risk. One day, I walked into the operations lounge and felt the conversation stall mid-sentence, the air too still to ignore. I had been there before, once early in my career, when I was the only woman at the executive table, and again when the founder had fallen ill and people had circled like vultures, waiting to see who'd inherit the fire. This was the same smell. Something was dying, and they were already writing the eulogy. But the moment everything clicked, the instant I knew, with absolute clarity, that I was being erased, was the day I passed Thomas's assistant outside a conference room, her phone on speaker. She was confirming a lunch meeting with StratEdge Systems, our largest vendor, the one I had personally negotiated with for the past 5 years. I stopped in the hallway, heart still, breath caught mid-step, as she said plainly, "Yes, Mr. Granger would like to discuss a transition plan. The idea is to phase Monica out gradually, make it smoother that way." It wasn't just betrayal. It was betrayal wrapped in calculation, made worse by how confidently they assumed I would never know. They wanted a silent exit, a slow fade into irrelevance, as if my fingerprints weren't on every operating manual, every vendor contract, every contingency plan that had kept this company standing. But what they didn't know, what Thomas never thought to consider, was that I had already taken steps, not out of paranoia, but because years in this world had taught me something invaluable. People often plot quietly, but the most dangerous mistake they make is assuming you aren't watching. For months, I had been monitoring StratEdge's filings after noticing inconsistencies in their delivery timelines. Quietly, without alerting anyone, I discovered they were struggling, hemorrhaging cash and seeking a private exit. An acquisition opportunity like that doesn't come often, and certainly not one this strategic. I didn't tell anyone at Norwell. Instead, I contacted Helen Ward, an old friend from business school who now ran a mid-sized private equity group out of Providence. Together we moved fast, established a holding firm, created a clean acquisition path, and locked the entire deal behind airtight confidentiality clauses. By the time Thomas was rehearsing how to remove me from the vendor negotiations, StratEdge had already changed hands. The holding company, Bayshore Capital, now owned the entire infrastructure Thomas was depending on for his ambitious Phase 2 growth model. And I was the managing partner behind it, though no one outside a sealed room in Providence had any idea. I didn't need theatrics. I didn't want revenge and fire or noise. I wanted clarity, undeniable strategic clarity that would expose exactly what happens when people mistake silence for surrender. So when Thomas delivered his smug farewell in front of my peers, when he smiled like a man who believed he had finally cleared the path, I stood still, nodded politely, and walked away. Not because I was defeated, but because the foundation beneath him was already mine. The supply chain his expansion depended on, the vendor he planned to repurpose without me, the architecture that couldn't be replaced in under 18 months. All of it now answered to me, and they didn't even know it yet. After the public dismissal, I returned to my office with a steadiness that surprised even me. I moved slowly, not because I was defeated, but because I needed the time to think, to absorb, and to begin saying goodbye to a space I had once treated like home. The brass fountain pen my team gave me last Christmas sat, untouched, beside a framed photo of my daughter's graduation. And as I ran my fingers along the edges of my desk, the same one I had worked at for nearly 6 years, I felt a kind of quiet grief settle in, not for the job itself, but for the meaning I had once attached to it. The silence in the corridors was different now. It wasn't respectful, it was strategic. The kind of silence that happens when people don't know whether they're allowed to speak to you anymore, or worse, when they've decided it's safer not to. Colleagues who had once sought my input now passed by without a word. Invitations to leadership briefings vanished from my calendar overnight. Entire conversations shifted to Slack channels I no longer had access to. And though no one said it aloud, I could see it in their eyes. That subtle flinch when they realized I was still there, still breathing in the air of a building that had already begun erasing me. It's a peculiar thing, the loneliness that follows betrayal. It isn't loud or obvious. It creeps in, wearing the face of professionalism, disguised as transition, dressed in phrases like realignment and fresh leadership perspective. But underneath it all, it's abandonment. And the hardest part wasn't the loss of title or power. It was realizing how quickly people could forget your loyalty the moment you were no longer useful to their climb. I boxed my things carefully, not because I had to, but because I refused to let them take my orderliness from me. Every object I packed carried a story, a project milestone, a late-night breakthrough, a note from someone who once believed in me. And as I placed each one into the cardboard container that now held the last physical proof of my legacy, I caught sight of my own reflection in the glass wall across the room. My face looked calm, but behind my eyes was something older than rage. Resolve. They thought they had taken everything. But what they didn't understand, what they never even bothered to consider, was that while they focused on titles and transitions, I had focused on what truly held power: the systems, the infrastructure, and the knowledge they had come to depend on, without ever fully grasping it. Still, the pain lingered in quieter moments. That first evening, after leaving the office, I sat at my usual spot in Luna's wine bar, tucked into a corner booth where I'd shared 100 strategy sessions and late-night laughs. Clara joined me shortly after, one of the few who hadn't disappeared. She slid into the booth with wide eyes and a half-formed question on her lips, but I stopped her with a nod and a faint smile. "It's done," I said softly, stirring the rim of my glass. "They made their move." She leaned in, whispering as though the walls themselves were listening, words spreading. "Thomas was celebrating after you left. But something shifted late this afternoon. Procurement hit a wall. StratEdge declined a contract revision, said all future communications must go through new ownership." He turned pale, Monica, like ghost white. I didn't reply. Not immediately. I simply lifted my glass and took a slow sip, letting the silence fill the space between us. Because while the grief was real, so was the preparation. And though the room may have been colder now, I was no longer walking through it empty-handed. The truth was, I had carried my value with me, not in a title, not in an email signature, but in the irreplaceable understanding of a system that couldn't survive without the very woman it had tried to forget. I didn't storm out of Norwell's glass tower, and I didn't slam any doors on my way down. Instead, I left the building like someone on their way to a quiet lunch, head high, pace measured, not because I wasn't wounded, but because I knew the next chapter wouldn't be written in fury or haste. It would be written with calculation, discretion, and silence, so deliberate it would echo louder than any outburst ever could. You see, I had spent the last 2 months not just surviving Thomas Granger's slow coup, but preparing for the inevitability of it. The day he was appointed CEO, something deep in my gut shifted. Not with panic, but with awareness. I've been around long enough to recognize the scent of ambition laced with contempt, and his walked into every meeting like a man already counting his casualties. From the moment his handshake avoided eye contact and his compliments danced around real substance, I understood what he saw when he looked at me. Not a partner, not a threat even, but an inconvenience. Something he'd need to streamline once the timing aligned. So I began collecting the quiet data points, the missed meetings, the back-channel decisions, the sudden changes in vendor communication that no one could quite explain. I noticed when my strategic plans were postponed for review, only to be repackaged a week later under someone else's name. But most of all, I watched as StratEdge Systems, the cornerstone supplier I had nurtured into exclusivity, became his next target. It was almost poetic, really, how blind he was to the lifeblood pulsing beneath his own Phase 2 dream. StratEdge wasn't just a vendor, they were the spinal cord of Norwell's infrastructure, embedded in every delivery pipeline, data process, and logistics schedule. And quietly, beneath the surface of press releases and QBRs, they were crumbling. I had begun reviewing their quarterly filings in my spare time, curious at first, then increasingly concerned. Revenue dips, staff cuts, investor silence. It was clear they were looking for a lifeline, or a buyer. And so I became that buyer, but not as Monica Laird, former COO of Norwell Dynamics. Number Y moved through shadows, working with Helen Ward and her firm in Providence, building a holding company with no traceable ties, and structuring a clean, quiet acquisition. I didn't make noise. I didn't seek validation. I followed the paper, negotiated the terms, and secured the deal behind layers of confidentiality, thick enough to hold back even the most eager legal department. By the time Thomas began negotiating with StratEdge to edge me out of contract oversight, they were no longer his vendor to manage. They were mine. And when his assistant finally contacted their CEO to push forward transition control, he was met with polite, firm instruction. All communications would now flow through Bayshore Capital's executive liaison. He didn't flinch at first, because he didn't understand. Not yet. Back in my home office, where I had started keeping late hours long before anyone noticed, I sat with my cup of tea, reading the signed acquisition documents under soft lamplight. The name at the bottom wasn't mine. It was the name of the holding company, but the authority behind it was me. And what I held now wasn't just leverage, it was infrastructure. Thomas thought he had clipped my wings, but I had bought the wind. That Friday, an email landed in my inbox, this time from HR. It was formal, procedural, requesting my assistance with transition materials and a checklist for offboarding. I smiled. The man who fired me in public was now asking for a favour as if we were colleagues parting ways after a team lunch. But I didn't let my pride answer. I let strategy take the wheel. My reply was crisp, professional, and devoid of emotion. Camille, I will ensure all materials are documented thoroughly. Regards, Monica. But each file I handed over, though clear, accurate, and within protocol, was just incomplete enough to make them reliant on the one partner they no longer controlled. Because at the heart of every major rollout, every operations module, and every upcoming automation plan sat StratEdge's proprietary codebase, and StratEdge was now behind a door only I held the key to. Later that day, Helen called from Boston. "They've started sniffing," she said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "One of Norwell's junior managers reached out to StratEdge, asking about revised delivery schedules. We responded by citing the recent acquisition. No names, no emotion, just facts." I nodded, watching the afternoon sun fade across my living room floor. "They'll escalate it by Monday," Helen added. "Good," I said softly. "Let them." Because while Thomas was busy polishing his ego and positioning for praise, I had turned the very ground beneath his feet into glass. And now all I had to do was wait for it to crack. By the time Monday arrived, the atmosphere at Norwell felt heavy, like a thunderstorm building behind glass. I woke early, brewed my coffee as usual, and logged in to the vendor portal from my home office, where I still had temporary access. The dashboards lit up in muted red. Q4 supplier contracts unconfirmed, 3 major product lines frozen in place if left unresolved. It was the kind of silence that didn't come from oversight, but from a system buckling under the weight of its own negligence. At 8:02 a.m., Clara texted from inside headquarters. "Thomas just stormed into the all-hands like a man chasing ghosts. Nobody knows what's going on, but he hasn't blinked since he walked in." I didn't respond immediately. I wanted the silence to do its work. Panic, when left uncomforted, tends to multiply. By mid-morning, LinkedIn was buzzing with speculation. A press release had dropped. StratEdge Systems acquired by Bayshore Capital. A new era in enterprise solutions. It was sterile in tone, as most corporate releases are, but those who had worked closely with me needed no additional context. They knew. At 11:12 a.m., an email arrived from Thomas. Subject: urgent. We need to talk. I forwarded it directly to Helen, who called minutes later, laughing in disbelief. He just realized who bought the kingdom he thought he ruled. But the most satisfying moment came not from his panic, but from the shift in recognition, the dawning realization among those who had once turned away that I had not vanished. I had simply stepped behind the curtain and rebuilt the stage. That afternoon, Norwell's procurement lead reached out, not to StratEdge, but directly to me. The message was polite, cautious, threaded with the awkward diplomacy of someone suddenly aware of their dependence. "Hi, Monica. I know things ended abruptly, but there seems to be some confusion regarding StratEdge. Would you be open to a brief call?" I didn't reply. Not because I held a grudge, but because it wasn't my place anymore. Bayshaw's legal team, under Helen's guidance, issued a formal notice clarifying that all future negotiations must proceed through my office. The next day brought new tremors. Clara messaged again. "He looks awful. DevOps just got pulled into a locked room meeting and 2 directors asked me if you were hiring." I typed a reply but let it sit in drafts. Sometimes letting the unknown speak louder than any answer is the better strategy. Meanwhile, Helen received a request from Norwell's legal team, an attempt to renegotiate the new licensing structure. Their tone was respectful but hopeful, clearly seeking softer terms. But we knew the truth. There were no other vendors. StratEdge wasn't just a line item. They were the infrastructure, and that infrastructure had been custom-built under my leadership. We sent our response, firm, professional, and without room for interpretation. The new agreement would remain as offered. Enterprise rates with premiums for data hosting, integration support, and most importantly, access to proprietary AI learning modules that powered Norwell's next-generation OpsNet. The contract was generous in structure but costly by comparison, and while some might call it ruthless, I called it fair. That evening, I walked through Bayshaw's new headquarters, formerly StratEdge's modest offices, now in the final stages of renovation. As I passed the strategy lab where whiteboards were being mounted and tech screens calibrated, I felt a stillness in my chest, not revenge, not vindication, but clarity. I hadn't burned bridges, I had simply built a better one, and they were now paying to cross it. At 9:07 p.m., my phone buzzed again, a voicemail from an unknown number. I let it play. It was Thomas. His voice was strained, clipped with panic hiding behind faux concern. "Monica, I think we need to start fresh. You're putting a lot of people at risk, people who supported you. I just hope you'll think about that." I stood in my kitchen, staring at the floor tiles, letting the message finish without expression. Because what he still didn't understand, what men like him rarely do, is that I hadn't put anyone at risk. I had safeguarded the one thing they never thought to protect: the foundation. By Wednesday, Norwell's board issued a company-wide communication acknowledging the transition. Carefully worded, lacking apology, but buried within was a single sentence that shifted everything. "We recognize the strategic value of the foundational systems developed under Monica Laird's leadership. Just that. Nothing more, nothing less. But for those of us who build in silence, that one sentence was thunder." That afternoon, Clara sent me a final update. "Emergency board meeting. Legal is involved. Rumor is Thomas won't make it to Friday." I stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone down, stepped outside onto the balcony, and looked at the skyline of a city that once felt too small to hold everything I had given. Now it looked just right. Thursday arrived with a crispness in the air that felt oddly ceremonial, as if even the weather had agreed that this was the day the tide would finally turn. I chose my outfit with quiet intention, a deep navy pantsuit, pressed and timeless, with my grandmother's sapphire ring on one hand and silver cufflinks on each wrist, not to signal power, but to remind myself that grace, when worn without apology, speaks louder than any name badge ever could. At exactly 9 a.m., I entered the boardroom on the 32nd floor of the Langston Tower, where Norwell's directors had requested a private meeting under the pretense of a strategic review. The receptionist greeted me without hesitation, as if nothing had changed, though everything clearly had. Inside, 6 members of the board sat around a long walnut table, their expressions carefully neutral, though some couldn't quite hold my gaze. A carafe of untouched coffee sat at the centre, flanked by untouched legal pads and pens too pristine to be useful. I greeted them calmly, placing a sleek black folder before me as I sat. "I understand you've requested insight into the StratEdge transition," I began, watching as heads tilted, pens clicked, and breathing slowed. Inside this folder, you'll find a detailed timeline, emails, filings, internal memos, all confirming that StratEdge was fully acquired by Bayshore Capital 3 weeks prior to my official departure. They listened in silence, perhaps expecting accusation or resentment, but I gave them neither. At the time of acquisition, I was no longer a Norwell employee, which means this is not a conflict of interest. This is simply a leadership oversight, one that unfortunately left your infrastructure exposed. A director in a grey suit leaned forward, furrowing his brow. Why didn't Thomas flag this sooner? Perhaps, I replied evenly, because he never imagined I'd still be playing the game, and certainly not from a higher seat. That answer seemed to land with weight. I saw it in the way shoulders straightened and eyes flicked between one another. They had believed Thomas's version of the story, that I had been too slow, too cautious, too stuck in the old ways. What they had failed to see was that those very instincts, patience, foresight, and restraint, were the same ones that had quietly secured the company's greatest asset and taken it with me. Later that day, back at Bayshore's newly renovated strategy lab, I met with my executive team to finalise the licensing proposal Norwell would now be required to sign. The contract was reasonable, generous even, but it made clear that StratEdge's services would no longer be discounted, deferred, or taken for granted. They would pay as they went, and they would acknowledge, in writing, the proprietary systems now licensed through my leadership. Do you think they'll sign it? Helen asked, sipping her coffee as we overlooked the city below. They have no choice, I said gently. But more than that, they'll finally understand who built the ground they stand on. And I was right. That Friday evening, just as the sun dipped beneath the skyline, I received an email from Richard Alvarez, Norwell's board chair. It was succinct, deliberate, and, though it never used the word, an apology, all the same. Dr. Laird, the board has reviewed Bayshore's terms and accepts them in full. We regret how your departure was handled and acknowledge the legacy of your work. While we cannot change the past, we hope this marks the beginning of a more respectful professional relationship. I read it once, then again, and finally closed my laptop, not with triumph, but with peace. Because this had never been about retribution. It was about being seen. It was about reclaiming my name from the footnotes and placing it, finally, at the top of the page where it had always belonged. A week later, Norwell announced a full leadership shake-up. Thomas was gone. Clara texted me that morning. It's official, no speech, just a cardboard box and a silent exit. They're calling the AI rollout the Ghost Project now. I smiled, but not out of joy. I smiled because I understood the cost of arrogance, and I knew that justice, when it arrives without malice, leaves a stronger echo than any public downfall. Months passed. Our systems expanded. 12 of Norwell's former clients migrated to our platform. 3 of them were ones I'd been told I would never land. And then, one afternoon, I received a call from Illa Grant, a former colleague who had once been pushed aside like I had, long before this story began. You've become the story I tell my daughter, she said, voice thick with emotion. When she feels like the world won't see her worth, you proved it's possible to lose everything and still come back. Not hardened, but stronger. That night, I pulled out the small box I had packed on my last day at Norwell. The pen, the farewell card, the photo of our $50 million milestone. I looked at them not with regret, but with clarity, because those years hadn't been wasted. They had forged me. And now, with the right people beside me, in a place I helped rebuild with my own hands, I wasn't just back. I was exactly where I was always meant to be. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that quiet strength can outlast loud ambition, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with someone who might need that reminder today. Welcome to the Underdog's Revenge, where we don't just tell stories, we reclaim them.